So I'm delighted to have Cinnamon Quale with us. And she has provided leadership and collaboration with sexual assault response teams throughout her 14 years of working for systems change. As a sexual assault advocate, she worked with survivors navigating through the judiciary system, and her leadership and collaboration developed protocols for child protection and local domestic violence agencies. Quale is currently Red Wing Consulting Incorporated's program coordinator. She continues to organize monthly web trainings, participates in the SART and sexual assault exam curriculum development, coordinates consultants, SART and sexual assault exam trainings. She was honored to become a team member of the National Technical Assistance provider, Red Wing Consulting Incorporated, and becoming its project coordinator for domestic violence prevention initiatives, the DVPI. She assists in the facilitation and development of OVW, tribal sexual assault, medical forensics examination protocol development, and provided a variety of community outreach tools across the nation. She's a founding member of Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition that organized in 2001 and has been a circle keeper for the board of directors from 2004 through 2010 in attempts to help improve systems of social change. She has organized a group of 47 teams across 4 towns and 1 reservation to provide dating violence awareness called TADA, or Teens Against Dating Abuse. In rural and reservation areas, Quale coordinated the development of a multidisciplinary response protocol for adult sexual assault victims. Quale provided professional, community, and volunteer educational trainings locally and at state and national conferences. She had developed a tribal sexual assault advocacy program and worked in a tribal shelter while participating in rural and reservation SART programs. Quale has twice assisted in drafting Violence Against Women's Act resolutions in 2003 at the National Congress of American Indians Conference. And Quale is a Dakota and a member of the Mendota Bedewakatan. Did I do that right?
Bedewakatan.
I knew I wasn't going to get that.
Close.
Close. Dakota community. She's from rural Minnesota, currently residing in Colorado, and she is the proud mother of 2 young men and the grandmother of a baby boy and baby girl. Her young men have grown up and participated in tribal coalition and victim advocacy meetings and activities, and they continue to be the center of her life. Join me in welcoming Cinnamon Quale.
Thank you. I'm going to try to be casual. And thank you all for coming. I appreciate it, and absolutely I am honored that you're all here and interested in expanding some of the untalked about population, which is American Indians, for various reasons. So really today, what I'm going to focus on is the difference, I think, between mainstream prostitution and trafficking and Native women. So I won't educate you on necessarily the trafficking and prostitution, but the Native piece of it and how that pertains to Indian country and Native women. Here in the Front Range, we have 60,000 American Indian people living in the Front Range, Denver, Colorado Springs, Pueblo area. And a lot of our statistics, we don't have a great deal of statistics, mostly because we're put in the other category when systems are gathering that information. And the other piece is funding hasn't always been available specific for Native populations. And so I'm going to interchange some of my terminology a little bit, and just so that you know, American Indian, Alaska Native is the terms I like to use, just because federal funding, people like to hear that term, American Indian, Alaska Native. But we also call ourselves American Indian, Native American, So I'll interchange those periodically throughout my day. And I'm definitely going to leave space for questions and comments, and I'll try to address them as much as I can. I have a couple resources with me that I'm going to be referring to that I'll be happy to share with you. You can also find them online. One, my biggest project was, it's called the Garden of Truth, and it's the prostitution and trafficking of Native women in Minnesota. And so back in 2007, I believe it was, we did interviews with the women there in Minnesota who were either prostituted or trafficked. And so our report is based off of those interviews from the 105 women that we interviewed. So I'm going to refer to this as well, and then I'll pass that around. You guys can look at it, take the information. You can find it online as well. Unfortunately, this is only a local research project that we did, but it's a great beginning. The other one I'm going to be referring to is Amnesty International report, and it was called The Maze of Injustice. And this was done in 2006 as well. And what it is Amnesty International went across the country and Alaska, did a series of interviews with social workers, law enforcement, different systems people to find out their response to Native women. They also interviewed victims of domestic violence, victims of sex assault, all American Indian women. So that was the focus of this report, and it's pretty comprehensive. There's been several changes since the report came out, but it says the failure to protect Indigenous women from sexual violence in the U.S. And it really talks about the barriers that women had in seeking services and services that were provided to them, and it's got several individual stories of what they lived, what they survived, and then going through the system and the barriers that they came across. So for me, I recommend this just as kind of a history piece, because things are in the process of being changed for Indian women, for reservations across the nation and Alaska in positive ways. But we also need to see where we've been so we can see where we're going to and what needs to change, or what things didn't work, what worked well. And so I'm a firm believer in that. So I'll be referring to those two as well. We have 552 tribes in the United States and Alaska. And like I said, 60,000 urban Indians on the Front Range here in Colorado alone. So today I'm just going to share with you the little bit that I know. Like I said, we're very new with funding specific for Indian country. As a matter of fact, our funding for the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition first came available in 2001. So states were already established with their coalitions, and one of the things that we found in our work over the last several years is that when you are working in mainstream and some of the mainstream trainings, about half of that applies to Indian country and applies to reservations. So we've also recently started, just this past year, providing twice a year domestic violence 40-hour training and tribal sex assault 40-hour training down in Colorado Springs. So it's very tribal specific, federal laws, tribal laws. We work with those participants so that they're more familiar with that as well. And just a little bit of history. Like I said, I'm a firm believer of knowing where we've been before we can move forward. And how many of you have heard of the boarding school era? Yeah. Can any of you share maybe what you heard or? So basically, what happened in the boarding school era, there's still boarding schools today. Some of them were owned by the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and some of them were owned by churches, were run by churches. So what happened was basically children as young as 5 were removed from their Indian homes, placed in the boarding schools, and for the most part, they were all very different. There were some good ones, so I want to say that. But for the most part, what had happened was they were not allowed to speak their language, and they were given other clothes to wear, so they weren't wearing the same clothes that they were used to. There was a lot of abuse that happened, both physical and sexual. And I know I did some research on the Canadian boarding schools as well, because there was boarding schools up there, very similar to the United States, with the abuse that happened here, and young children removed from their homes. Some didn't go home in the summertime, some never made it back home, and some didn't go home until they had graduated school. And there was hundreds that had died along the way. There was not good records kept back then. So there was, families were really broken up. And for me as a mother and a new grandmother, I think it would be really difficult for my children to be taken from me without a choice, without it being my choice. And that's really what happened. And while they were there also, they were not allowed to, their ceremonies, they weren't allowed to pray and practice their ceremonies, go through sweat lodge, those sorts of things. So everything that a young child has grown up in or knows, that's kind of their whole world, their family structure, their relatives were real important. Children were really raised by the community themselves, by the villages themselves. So, my children, if they're out playing, why not might be, neighboring within that village would watch over my children as if they were her own as well. And so we take care of, really true today on reservations, that we take care of all of the children, no matter whose they are, they're ours. And so that whole structure was removed. One of the reasons why I wanted to go over the historical context piece of it is to kind of show that breakdown of loss of control over yourself, over your family, over your community, and show that vulnerability maybe that was put in place. And I think that's an important piece when it comes to prostitution and trafficking, because the target population are vulnerable people, whether it's boys, men, women, girls, and so that's a piece of it. The Major Crimes Act transferred jurisdiction over major crimes from the tribes to the federal government. They had in place a system of taking care of major crimes, of any crimes that had happened within their reservation, within their community, but that was taken from them as well. The General Allotment Act, or Dow's Act, many of you may have heard of the Dow's Act, where 90 million acres of Indian land was lost to the government, where they redistributed it. 1910, Sundance was outlawed, ceremonies remained underground. My family are Sundancers, and to us that's like the most important ceremony, the time that we pray the most. It's where we connect with the Creator, with the Great Spirit. So for me, that's been my lifesaver, where many of you might go to church or pray, or Easter or Christmas time might be your most important to your family. For those of you that might be religious, Sundance is most important to our family. So there's just a long history of removing people from the security of their homelands, from their families, from their culture, and it's had a disastrous effect. The other piece was there's a policy of termination that where the reservation boundaries were put in place. So the gathering of food, the hunting, some tribes travel seasonally to different areas to provide for their families and their villages, whereas now they were put onto reservations. I know my grandfather talked about not being able to leave the reservation without his work pass. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I remember him saying that multiple times when I was a child. So, and then in the 1978, we had the Indian Freedom of Religious Act, which we brought back our Sundance. Some of those ceremonies came back from underground. In that meantime, that healing process and dealing with the most important things to our families was that healing. And so trying to piece some of those ceremonies and those traditions back was really important. There was also a time of, in the 1970s, an estimated of 42% of Native women of childbearing age were sterilized. Most of them did not know that they were sterilized. And a matter of fact, it was Indian Health Service. They're the ones that provide the clinics and stuff on the tribes, on the reservations. They were the ones that implemented it. Some of the women would have a child, and then they wouldn't have any more children, and they didn't know why. Most of them didn't know that they were even sterilized. So, and Amnesty International actually talks about that a little bit. Indigenous women have suffered under federal government sterilization programs which violated their human rights and international law. For example, between 1972 and 1976, thousands of Indigenous women were sterilized when there was no medical necessity and without their free and informed consent. Some women were reportedly coerced to consent to sterilization by being told that their children would be taken from them if they refused. There was also, most recently, a video game called Custer's Revenge that was marketed by a private company in 1989. The objective was for players to manipulate the character of General Custer to have sex with a Native American woman who was bound to a post. So the negative and dehumanizing stereotypes of Native Americans in general and Indigenous women in particular are not confined to distant history. 1968 federal appellate court ruling upheld a statute under which American Indian man who committed rape in Indian country received a lower penalty if the victim was a Native American woman. So that's really the message that has been sent across the country to both Indian women, to perpetrators, that Indian women are less than. And I think for me, when we did the research on, when we were doing the interviews of the Native women in Minnesota, it was that same mentality that they felt less than. And then during the assaults, it was also dehumanizing. And I'll read some of their quotes. We were able to capture a lot of their stories, so I'll share that with you as well here shortly. 1 in 3 American Indian women will be sexually assaulted in her lifetime. 87% of sex assaults are perpetrated by non-Native men. And I think that's an important piece that we want to look at. That was one of the findings that Amnesty International also found, that the overwhelming majority were non-Native perpetrators. And that's different than mainstream statistics as well. Indian women are more likely to suffer a sex assault by multiple perpetrators. They're more likely to be sexually assaulted in a public place. They're more likely to suffer serious injury. We have the highest rates of stalking, which is often the prelude of homicide and sex assault. And also weapons, we have higher rates where weapons are used in the assault. We also have one of the highest suicide rates and poverty rates. So I think, given that little bit of history there, that shows a little bit of the vulnerability of our population. We also have high rates of missing and murdered women. And I don't know if any of you have heard about, there's actually 3 places that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. One is Juarez, Mexico. If you've heard of missing Indigenous women on the border towns of Mexico there. And also up in Canada. They've been more active up in Canada to bring awareness. I think the last number there was a college student that went ahead and gathered the names, and that's all published online. So if you Google Canadian Indigenous women or missing and murdered women from Canada, you'll be able to find that list. I've heard like 560 some over the years, and recently a college student had said, well, we're going to find out exactly what the numbers are, and did her research project on that, and it was 824, I believe, but it was quite a bit higher. 824 is the database as of January of last year, 2014. That was the last database that I could find, which is significantly higher. But and there's not a lot of attention brought to that. I think when we talk about prostitution and sex trafficking, it's really, I want to make sure that we're on the same page. So exchange for food, money, drugs, housing, transportation, for sex. In my personal experience has really been working with women who have exchanged sex for transportation, food, housing, that sort of thing. And I think they've gotten savvy. Some of the women go into survival mode because they are so isolated, and they are living in poverty. Just getting transportation maybe to the grocery store might be an hour away, and they don't have a car or gas money. And I know there's a belief, somewhat of a belief system out there that Indians have casinos, but not all tribes have casinos. And some of the tribes that even do have casinos, it doesn't make them wealthy for various reasons. So the poverty is fairly high there. And I just want to bring some attention to pimps as batterers. That same mentality, keeping them isolated, keeping them away from their friends or family, manipulating. I think that's fairly common across the board, not just in Indian country as well. So making sure that her support system is them, is that pimp or that group of people that are containing her. The other piece I've seen, and so my experience, I'm going to share with you my personal experience with prostitution. My ex-brother-in-law ended up dying in jail. But one of the things, what he did, I think he was truly an evil person. And just from childhood on. And so what had happened throughout his life, I had met several women that had come to me and said, ex-girlfriends that he had raped. As he grew older and he was on drugs throughout his life, I was working at a local program, and a woman came in and identified herself. Well, I had realized she had identified her perpetrator, who had kidnapped her and held her for several days, drugged her up, and him and other men throughout those several days had prostituted her out. And so there was a rotation of men coming and going through that home, and she was able to escape, thank goodness, out the bedroom window. And law enforcement had a really hard time believing her. And they had a hard time believing her, one, because she had dabbled in drugs. So she wasn't the perfect victim. And that's kind of my point of this story, is that there's not always perfect victims. And so she had dabbled in drugs. She was handicapped. She was not, they weren't believing her story. And they didn't believe it until it happened a month later. So it wasn't even that very long after that. It happened a month or two later, and the woman, same exact thing had happened to that woman. She was kidnapped, held, she was shot up with drugs. When she escaped, she ended up checking herself into a hospital, a psych ward. She just couldn't deal with the things that had happened to her. I think for that particular person, just because I personally knew him, our family had nothing to do with him. He wasn't allowed around us, but he passed away in jail after being arrested for that, and I was thankful for that. I don't believe there was ever any help for him as a perpetrator. He had been a perpetrator for 50 years of his life, in many different ways. So, but he was very much, had all of those behaviors. And when I was preparing for this, I was trying to think of, things I had heard from women that I had worked with, and my own experiences, and really wanting to share that with you. And he was all of those things. Oh my gosh, he was savvy. He was, he would try to sweet talk women, all of these things just to get what he wanted. And I think that is common as well across mainstream and in Indian country. So I want to acknowledge there's long-term effects, life-changing, root causes of, I believe the root causes are drugs and alcohol is the abuse suffered or seen, that we've survived, that we grew up in. I think Indian country, like it or not, we have high rates, one of the highest rates of drug abuse and alcohol abuse. So I want to acknowledge that piece, and it's hard for many tribes to acknowledge that as well, because we want to say, hey, we need help. We're dysfunctioning. We have sex assaults happening here. We don't know how to address it. So one of the things that we did as coalition when the tribal coalitions first got their funding is we went to the National Congress of American Indians. And we said, hey, we're here now. We finally are able to organize and bring you some of our stories that each of us can bring from our own areas. And so National Congress of American Indians listened to us. They still, to this day, know who we are. They rely on us for information. They've supported our efforts in getting specific funding for programs. We're behind in direct service programs, both domestic violence and sex assault programs. And you know, when things like that happen, it's difficult. It's difficult to go home. So we want to make sure that we're continuing that support system. One of the things that Redwind has been doing is working with programs that are trying to get up and going so that they have the appropriate support so their programs can be effective. So it's one of the most traumatic crimes that happen to women. It's life-changing, you know. It's assaults on your spirit, on who you are as a woman. And so we want to acknowledge that as well. I also wanted to bring up, I'm trying to remember what the name of this was. I was interviewed a few years ago when I was doing direct services. There was a project out of Minneapolis, an applied research project. Shattered Hearts is the name of it. And VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, VAWAnet.org. I found it online yesterday. I'm like, oh, it's up there. But their report is up there as well. So they did a series of interviews with direct service providers and gathered information. So I'm just going to do a little bit of referring to that as well. Some of the barriers addressing sex trafficking is lack of knowledge and training, lack of cultural appropriate resources. Most of the women, I would say 98% of the women that I worked with, when they came to shelter, when they came to the crisis agencies, were wanting those ceremonies, were wanting to smudge, were wanting to pray, were wanting their traditional ways, even if they hadn't practiced it in a long time. That was one of the main healing pieces for those women. And so I tell you that so that whatever you may become after you leave school, that when you are responding to Indian women, that getting those women in touch, or even bringing that up in conversation, you know, is there a traditional leader, is there a spiritual healer that you know, or that your family knows, that you trust, that there might be ceremony to help them through that difficult time in their life. And I think that's the most important piece, is their healing process. Lack of tribal codes and tribal authority, high caseloads. There are also high turnover. So if you go to reservations, if any of you work on reservations, you'll see there's a high turnover in law enforcement. There's a high turnover at the clinics, at the hospitals. It's almost like a training facility before people are like, okay, I'm going to the real world now. There's high turnover. And so when you get an appropriate response, a protocol down, a process to respond to victims, it's hard to maintain that because of the high turnover. So even working at hospitals, some of the hospitals, it was like, well, where's your protocol? And have these great protocols, simple checklists, okay, did I cover this? Did I cover that? Did I do this? And they have it posted right in the exam room, or the officers would keep it right in their cars handy, and they don't even refer to it. They don't even look at it. And for me, when I did the protocols, I was part of a pilot project back in 2004, I think, is when we started that pilot project. There was 8 areas where it covered both reservation land and county or city land, property authority, judicial. So the judicial system wasn't clean cut, and that's where most of what Amnesty International talks about in their report is that it's not always clear who has the jurisdiction over where the crime is committed. One of the pilot projects, I coordinated that sexual assault response team, and it was really, really great. We all sat down at the table. Everyone at that time was kind of doing their own thing, and we think, if we can get the right people to the table at the right time, we'll figure it out. And that's very true. But the challenge is getting everyone there and on the same page without that power struggle over jurisdictions, over, I don't know. It was just that power struggle that we had to get through. But we were able to establish some of the jurisdiction. So one of the pieces with Indian country is we have resort areas, fishing, hunting, casinos, and where I grew up was a resort area as well. And it had all of that, and snowmobiling, all of those things. But there was a lot of challenges, and for us it was Minnesota, land of 10,000 lakes. So you have a lake, you might have 3-4 different jurisdictions around that lake. And so in the wintertime, when the lakes freeze over and they have ice fishing, so they all put like ice houses, little sheds out there, go fishing for the week, for the weekend. They have parties out there, and there's that's a time when the pimps or perpetrators bring out Indian women, and they'll be knocking on the doors, do you want company, that sort of thing, because they find an opportunity to make that money. We were at one casino, and we were working with the local programs there on the reservation down in Arizona, and we asked them just in conversation. It was totally different. They were developing, in the middle of developing a shelter program and an advocacy crisis program, and we asked them, do you have any issues with trafficking or prostitution here at the casino? Because they had this big, beautiful casino. And they're like, no, we don't have that here. Well, there was 3 of us staff, and we were in the lobby, and we all had our laptops out, and we were doing some work in preparation for our meeting for the next day. And pretty soon we noticed some of the same cycle of people coming and going, and it's like, so we purposely worked late into the evening just so that we could get a better grip on what was going on. And there was definitely prostitution, and it was, I think it was known by some of the workers there at the casino. Just our own observation, but being aware, I think helped us to shed some light on it as well. Recently, we've had, so Canada, I told you a little bit about Canada. They recently had a lawsuit. By recently, I mean over the last 10 years, had a lawsuit against the government for the atrocities that happened in the boarding schools. And some of their findings when I did research were, you'll probably be able to find it online as well. But they listed the findings of sex assault and abuse that had happened. And when they won that lawsuit, the indigenous people up there won the lawsuit. And they were awarded, however much money, I don't even remember. But during that time, from the time that it opened the door and that lawsuit was filed to the time that they won, there was a large number of elders that ended up committing suicide during that period of time. And what had happened was they opened that can of worms, and they didn't have the appropriate supports in place to help those survivors deal with everything coming back up again. And so I share that with you because it's something that's delicate in Indian country, that boarding school. We don't want that to happen anywhere, much less on our watch. And so I just wanted to share that with you as well. And this is a great saying I love. Every day, women survive physical or sexual violence. Some survive as a result of services they receive in the aftermath of the abuse. And again, I share that with you because whatever field you go into after you leave school, I hope that you take that with you, and that you stay open and make sure that we're treating the women holistically with the services that we're providing. We believe individuals are their own experts, and balances of all aspects. And so what that really means, I do have it on here. What that really means is when you are working with women that are survivors, Native women, Indigenous women, I think it's important that you honor all relationships. Like I talked about earlier, we take care of each other's children, and that's true on and off the reservation. I think Indian families just really, they connect with each other. And everything that we put in place really needs to demonstrate that respect. There's been a history of rules and laws that are put in place and are punitive, but I think our goal is really to make sure that we're maintaining that integrity. In some programs I look at, like they have this free mission statement, we honor and respect women, and we're gonna find justice for the survivors. But then how they do their work is kind of punitive. And it's an expectation. We have certain expectations. Well, your survivor may be dealing with drug addiction and alcohol addiction. They may be in the child protection, working with child protection, where they're involved and they have an open case. Maybe they've lost their children. They have multiple issues. So it's not clear cut, but it's important, I think, especially for Indian women, that that we create that sister space. How would we want our sisters to be treated, or our mothers to be treated when we're working with them? And that's how we treat each other. So the advocate working in sister space has the ability to recognize how what they're doing will have an impact on their life. Put themselves in their shoes. You heard of walking in her shoes or in her own shoes. That's similar to what we as Indian women do when we're supporting each other, trying to help each other. So traditional circle of healing. I think it's important to recognize that all tribes have different ways of different tribal practices, different traditions, different languages. Like I said, we have 552 tribes. We're not all the same, but we have some universal tribal values, and that's what I really wanted to share with you. One, that women and children are sacred, and we respect each other, and we respect that women are life givers. We respect all living things. We celebrate our differences. Even in the midst of alcohol abuse and the high rates of suicide and sex abuse, and surviving that, that our tribal values and going back to our traditional ways is really, I think, the key to the healing piece of when you're working with women. If you can connect them back with their tribal ways or their ceremonies, knowing who your contacts might be. You may not have all the answers, but know who your people are. Know who you can call for some direction. Because we have spiritual leaders, or they call themselves spiritual leaders, and they're perpetrators. So it's important that you know who you're referring to if you're doing that. But finding people that you trust, and you know in your gut if you trust people. And that's what we really go by, is listening to that instinct. And first, do no harm. Helping and do no harm. So our songs, all of these things, our spirituality, our language, our stories and our lessons that we learn, the dances, traditional medicines, they're all healing for survivors, whether it's domestic violence, sex assault, prostitution and trafficking. I know, like for my tribe, when there's something tragic that happens to you as a woman, one of our ceremonies, and we have several ceremonies, but one of our ceremonies is taking a cedar bath, you know, and for us that's a cleansing. There's a prayer that goes with it. There's all of those things, and it's like washing away the ick, you know, that sort of thing is what I'm talking about when you're working with Native women. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit about our findings and some of the information that we gathered during our research. We interviewed 105 Native women for approximately hour and a half each. And there was 4 main questions that we had asked about family history, sexual and physical violence throughout their lifetime, homelessness, and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Most of the women that we interviewed felt that they didn't know what they were getting into. They didn't realize that there was terminology for prostitution or trafficking, and there was a deception or trickery, and that's similar to mainstream, I think, is that there's that trickery and deception to those in enticing those women. 79% of the women interviewed had been sexually abused as children by an average of 4 perpetrators. More than 2/3 of the 105 women had family members who attended boarding schools. 92% of them were raped. 48% of them had been used by more than 200 sex buyers during their lifetime. 16% had been used by at least 900 sex buyers. 84% had been physically assaulted in prostitution. And that really compares to the slide where it shows pimps and batterers, how similar they are. 72% had suffered traumatic brain injuries during prostitution. 98% were currently and previously homeless. So 98% were currently or previously homeless. And that really identifies as well with that target vulnerable population, I think. 33% of Native cultural or spiritual practice identified as an important part of who they were. 71% had symptoms of disassociation. 92% wanted to escape prostitution, and their most frequently stated need for individual counseling, 75%, and peer support, 73%, reflecting a need for the unique experiences as Native women in prostitution to be heard and seen by people who care about them. Most wanted access to Native healing approaches integrated with a range of mainstream services. And I just want to say that prostitution is just now being looked at in Indian country, and it's not, we're very, very, very beginning stages of it as well. I think in Indian country, we're just getting grounded with domestic violence and domestic violence services, working our way up to sex assault, much less addressing prostitution and trafficking. One of the biggest gaps that I found in doing the sexual assault response teams was I had sat on the team in Minnesota. I talked about that for the pilot project, and then I had sat on 2 other teams, and then after that I had worked with, we spent 2 years working across the country and up in Alaska, trying to coordinate some of the sexual assault response teams. So there was still a large disconnect, much less with addressing prostitution and trafficking. And like I said earlier, was oftentimes either the right questions are not being asked to capture that information, or we're put in the other category. And so just keep that in mind when you are doing surveys and working in those systems. So here are some of the quotes from Native American women that we interviewed. As far as I'm concerned, all prostitution is rape. It's like incest. No one wants to talk about it. Prostitution is dangerous. It's like suicide. When a man looks at a prostitute and a Native woman, he looks at them the same, dirty. And these are their words. These are their quotes. There's times I'd walk around in spaced out, because when I stop to think about the reality, I break down and can't handle it. John said to me, "I thought we killed all of you." Another woman said, "Women like myself need someone they feel they can trust without being judged and by how they've lived their life. We didn't wake up and choose to become a whore or a hooker or a hoe, as they call us. We need someone to understand where we came from and how we lived, and that half of us were raped, beaten, and made to sell our bodies. We need people with hearts." Another woman said, "My culture doesn't put you around drugs or alcohol. It teaches you different values. It gives you belonging and faith." One says, "I was in the hospital. I was unstable, depression. It was a bad spirit. I wanted to smudge and was not allowed to." I remember one woman shared her story with me. She had come into our shelter, and she was the same age as me. I'm in my 40s. But she had come in, and she was the same age as me. She had 2 young children with her. And that was all she knew. That she didn't know of life any differently. Her mother had prostituted her out to their landlord so that they would have a place to live. Another woman I worked with had escaped her father, and had 2 children by her father, who also prostituted her out as well. The neighboring towns, neighboring the reservations, looked at Indian women as exotic. And now recently I'm hearing stories that they, want them to pretend
To be different ethnicities, yeah.
to be different ethnicities. So like Asian or they're considered exotic with some of the Johns and perpetrators. So I think for me, it was really a matter of helping the women to find a different way of life. And that one particular woman who escaped her father with her children, she, I don't know what the distance was, maybe 500 miles, had moved to another larger city. Her brothers showed up on her doorstep, kidnapped her back, her and her children, took her back to the reservation, and held her for a couple months there. So it was ingrained in that particular family how she was going to be treated. And she had the courage to escape again. And I was so glad she was able to escape again. But I wanted to share that with you. The other piece was, I don't know if you've ever heard of Christine Stark. She is an author. She's actually from Minnesota as well, a dear friend of mine. She has a couple books out. One of them is called Not for Sale. And she's really talks a lot about her life and being trafficked by her family as well, and how men would come up and feel inside of her mouth to see if she was diseased. But she talks about that, and all of those women that I'm talking about have also told me, once they've left home or were able to escape home, what do you suppose they did for income? They went into prostitution. And that's how they knew to survive. And none of them wanted to stay there. And I had fought for several of the women that ended up in our shelter because they had a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day stay. And when you have multiple layers and years of that oppression and that abuse and that violence, 30 days, 60 days in a shelter is not going to have an impact on what they end up doing when they leave the shelter. And luckily, the shelters that I've worked in and worked with some of the women were flexible enough to extend that until she was on her healing journey. And so that really is key. I don't know how many of you have heard of prostitution and trafficking in the oil fields up in like North Dakota and Montana. So since they've recently found oil up in those rural areas, reservations have also been impacted. And one of the things that's been happening is when I first started hearing they have man camps, where there's like a tent city or temporary homes where the workers will stay and do their work. And most of them are flying back and forth to their families, in other states and just going there for work specifically. And then we started hearing when we were doing the sexual assault response teams. And we had one officer who came to the training, and it was held up in North Dakota. And he's like, we can't even keep officers on board because they're working at the oil fields because they're making, 3-4 times more money. And so law enforcement, keeping that structure was difficult. And also the court systems are being slammed with prostitution and trafficking cases. And they're really trying to get a grip on it. There still are, but it's caught national attention, and they're trying to get things in place right now. But all those border towns, they're having a difficult time because what started as the pimps trafficking like women from Vegas through those oil fields along that way, they were also picking up some of the native women. So if other women, non-native women, were being trafficked and prostituted coming in, what's happening to our young Indian girls, that think, oh my gosh, what am I getting into, or what a lifestyle, how great it is, because deception and trickery is a huge piece of it, right? And so now it's opened the door even more to say, we need to protect our young women. And I think especially with Native women who are more private and not outspoken about sex and that sort of thing, not outspoken towards violence or drawing attention for those sorts of things has been really difficult for those young women. A piece of it was they started out, maybe let's take some photos, let's do a video, and then they got dirt on those girls, and then they scare them, and then they get them hooked on the drugs, which is all very similar to mainstream. But the locations, I think, are probably different. Like I said, we have casinos, we have tourist areas, we have the oil booms in rural reservation areas where they've never had money. They're one of the poorest reservations in the United States. And now all of a sudden they've got all these people, all this chaos, all this money. And then you have South Dakota, which they don't have the money. They're still the really poor reservations who are struggling. Minnesota, we've got poor reservations there. And there were pimps that would go to the parties. So between South Dakota and Minnesota, those are the ones that I only know about. Hey, let's go to North Dakota for the weekend. Let's go make some money, that sort of thing. Anchorage, just March of this year, there was 2 people that were charged operating prostitution ring out of Anchorage. They were recruiting younger, vulnerable Native women, forcing them to engage in prostitution through emotional manipulation, fear, physical force, but they purposely targeted the Indian girls, the Native women. If they don't make enough money, they're deprived food and necessities. I think that is common across the board. Canada, 824 missing and murdered Native women in Canada alone. For one young woman or girl, a trafficker will have a financial gain of $300,000 a year. And as you know, unlike drugs, you can sell women over and over and over again, versus drugs, you sell them once and it's gone, right? Homicides in Juarez, violent deaths of hundreds of women and girls since 1993 in the northern Mexican region of Juarez and border cities across the Rio Grande from El Paso, Texas to Juarez.
So we're going to start off with, we'll take questions from the crowd, but I think maybe I'll start with maybe what do you see as some possible solutions maybe moving forward, both from people in the outside communities and maybe people who maybe are living on Indian land. What do you think would be maybe the number one thing that could be done to help men and women in this situation?
So I've thought long and hard about what are the solutions, and for me, I think what moves a Native community, what moves tribal community, really is the community as a whole. And many times, most reservations, they have a tribal government. If you think of a reservation as a whole nother country, okay, that's probably the easiest way I can describe it. They're their own sovereign nation, their own country. They have their own government, their own tribal laws and tribal codes. Most of them, we've been working diligently to update their tribal codes to address domestic violence, sex assault, and sex trafficking. The other piece is, for the most part, tribes do not have jurisdiction over non-native offenders. However, what we're finding is the prostitution and trafficking isn't necessarily happening on the reservation. It's happening on those border towns, which is good. It's good because then there's more legal jurisdiction. So I guess my answer really to that is to look at it as a whole. Even though they have their own tribal codes and government, they also have, most of them will have like an elders committee, which is the tribal leaders go to the tribal elders for approval and for guidance. And so between them two, you always want to address and get your approval from the elders in that community. I think the other piece is community awareness, and not necessarily even awareness. I think saying those words, saying sex assault, saying prostitution and trafficking, knowing how vulnerable our population really truly is eye-opener. And so bringing that information to the community and doing that community awareness. One of the things that I found when I developed the sex assault advocacy program on one of the reservations was they didn't even really talk about domestic violence. And I had went and got the support, talked with the elders committee several times, got their support, acknowledged that most of them were probably survivors and had dealt with their own victimizations. So we started there at that process. So making sure you have that support in place. The second piece of that was then I went to the community, and every month the community would have a sobriety feast. So go to where the community gathers, even though it's like, what, sobriety feast, you know? But everybody would go there to eat, get their free dinner once a month, and to have their social hour. And And so I had called the coordinator of that, and I asked them, I'm like, can I come and speak just for 5 minutes? Give me 5 minutes. And she's like, well, I guess. And I said, well, you know, is there something wrong? Do you not want me there? Because it is a sobriety feast, and I'm talking about this whole other topic, you know. And she's like, well, we've never even had a speaker. So I'm like, oh man, you guys have an awesome opportunity to reach the community as a whole. And I was terrified. But I went there and I just put out the statistics, you know. We're one of the most vulnerable populations. We want to recognize that that we're vulnerable. We want to recognize that we need help and that we need to address this. And I can't do it myself and blah, blah, blah. And it turned out great. So my suggestion, identify your allies in the Native community, identify the elders in that community, and address it, start the approach there. And recognize that most of them don't have those supports in place, like the advocacy programs, you know, and even the advocacy programs that are in place are not equipped to deal with sex trafficking and prostitution at this point. So if they have a support in place helping them to identify what they can do to help.
Okay, so maybe let's open it up for questions. Okay, maybe we'll start with Mr.
So, Cindy, you already talked about this a little bit, and I was curious, maybe you'd say a couple more words. I first became aware of this issue with Native women because of the Minnesota study, and earlier before that, and then Native First People issues that were being raised. And I was always curious as to why this had not, very little work had been done in Indian country. And you talked about that you just started that process, just talking about domestic violence, let alone those other kinds of issues. Why do you think it's taken so long for this topic, even just domestic violence, let alone the other, to get started in Indian country? I mean, this is around, it's one of the most significant areas in the United States. Again, it seems, I kept looking for information on Indian country, this issue, and there was nothing there.
There's not. You do research, you're not going to find much because I think there hasn't been the research in Indian country. The other piece of it is that uniform reporting system that's in place. We lack that in Indian country. So one of the things we tried to do in all 3 of the sexual assault response teams that I sat on was gather statistical data. So law enforcement, we had law enforcement on our team, we had prosecution on our team, we had the hospital on our team, we had the advocacy program, Department of Corrections, all of these people on our team, but we were all gathering information differently. And we gathered it really according to our funding source, because our funding source says, well, we want to know this, this, and this to give you, this money. And so it was all a little bit different. The other piece is some of the law enforcement agencies were so small that they didn't have to make those reports. It was because they recognized that, hey, you don't have that capacity, so you don't have to collect this information. So uniform reporting and lack of funding. 2001 was the first time we had received specific funding for tribal coalitions. And prior to that, we didn't have any specific funding for tribal coalitions. It was all state coalition funded. And then when we met with National Congress of American Indians, we're like, hey, you know, we have these tribal coalitions, we're still lacking funds for those services, for those advocacy programs. So they have mandated, VAWA, Violence Against Women Act 2005, mandated a 10% set aside specific for tribes. So that's why I say we're still in our very beginning stages. And that 10% hasn't been a large amount. Along with that, Red Wind has been one of the technical assistance providers, but helping those programs get established, there's not a lot of resources out there. That's one of the things that we do at Red Wind as well. So, yeah.
We have time for maybe one more question. So,
I've been a director of a battered women's shelter in Rapid City, Women Against Violence, and I tried to get women from all the reservations to be able to come there. But my advocates were like 20 years behind the rest of the world, and they didn't want natives there. So we started Chungleshka. So Chungleshka has fallen because of tribal funding. So what happens is the tribe wants to take all the money, and they disagree about what's going on with the money, so they don't let them do what is needed. That is a big thing. That's really big. And Karen Artichoker was my supervisor. She graduated from CU Boulder. I also found out from Joanne Shenandoah that they did a study, and one of the things that's going on in Minnesota at the Mall of America on the 3rd floor is that they have a modeling agency. And so they ask, you know, they entice girls, come and be a model, you know, travel. But they don't say that sometimes it's international. So not only are they being trafficked here in the United States, they're being taken to other countries. And that is also taking place in Duluth, Minnesota. They're being put on ships and being taken.
The Great Lakes, yes.
So there's over 1,100 missing and murdered Indigenous women in the United States and in Canada. I know at CU Boulder, our Oyate Indigenous Student Organization had a march in February, and we walked down 16th Street Mall, and it ended up at the Capitol talking about this very thing. So it's domestic violence, it's trafficking, you know, murdered and missing Indigenous women.
So maybe then as a final question to go off of that, something that I've gotten from some of the audience members, since you've talked about kind of the history of exploitation that's happened, are we seeing in a lack of data, are we also seeing, in addition to the women who are falling into the sex trafficking, are there also women who are being labor trafficked, and are there men who are being labor trafficked and sex trafficked as well? I know that the kind of the scope of your presentation was very much on that sex trafficking issue, but are we also seeing women being trafficked into labor as well, or our male component too?
I'm not sure.
Males are being trafficked in the men's camps. They're being kidnapped and taken. And in the men's camp, 75% is male on male. So that's something that's kind of different too.
This is, I mean, the oil fields is still, it's all really new, like,
Scary.
you know what, 5 years old maybe. So it all happened so quickly, like all the oil boom, and all these people gathered, and you know, all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, what's happening? The grocery stores, the fast food restaurants, the everything could not even keep up. Housing couldn't keep up with the transition that was happening there.
So do you think that there's a natural maybe underreporting by both outside populations and the native population?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's underreporting. You know, there's a lot of shame, I think, that goes with that. Why didn't I know better? How could I have let this happen? You know, self-blame, and then to go back to your family and face your family after what's happened to you with that self-blame, I think has been really challenging for women. And I think just, gosh, all I can say is the more we talk about it, the more we bring it out, and the more we make those supportive resources available, I think the more important it is. And I know even on YouTube that, you know, some of the young women that were coerced into making videos and coerced into prostitution are up on video and up on YouTube. And they keep popping up. And, you know, again, it's from reservations that are very, very poor. You know, they're not used to having any financial anything, and so they're looking at, wow, I can make this money and do this video once without realizing exactly what they're getting into, or that it's, you know, once it's on the internet, it's gone. It's totally gone.
All right, well, thank you very much.